Good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure being here. Thanks for inviting me, representing JP Morgan. Last speaker, last session, so I'll try to be as brief as possible for a number of reasons, actually. The first one, of course, is the fact that I'm the last speaker of the last session. I also think that simple is elegant, so we have to keep it short, concise, to the point. I'm a market guy, right? So the attention span of those people that I usually interact with is quite limited. So I have to be very precise in my remarks. So what I'll try to do is just give you a quick snapshot of the growing importance of China for the Latin American Caribbean region. It matters a lot. The first question, of course, I just answered, right? Does it matter? Does China matter? It matters a lot. It matters actually a lot more than a lot of people have realized. And the market has tracked this for quite a bit of time. So the importance of China not only is quite significant, but it's been increasing over time as well, as some of the graphs that I'll show you would suggest. So just to give you a sense of order of magnitude here, last year Latin America and the Caribbean exports to China amounted to $109 billion. This is roughly 10% of total exports going out of the Latin America region. Imports, on the other hand, accounted to amounted to $139 billion. So that gives us a trade deficit of roughly $30 billion. Once again, order of magnitude, this is roughly equivalent to 0.6% of regional GDP. So it matters. It matters quite a bit. The volume of exports has been growing quite significantly. In fact, last year, on average, the main export products out of Latin America to China, which are iron, soybeans, copper, and oil, increased on average 22%. This is the volume of exports. The value of exports, of course, didn't increase all that much. And if you look specifically at the value of these four export products that I just mentioned, they contracted on average about 20%. So it's a good thing that the world demanded more of these products because the price of those products was significantly lower. So on a net basis, the trade deficit was roughly the same in 2015 as it was the year before, but the volume was significantly higher. Latin American exports to China are quite concentrated in a number of products. In fact, if you look at the first table here on the left, you'll clearly see that the five main export products account for roughly 70% of the total. I mentioned those already: iron, soybeans, copper, and oil. Imports from China to Latin America are actually quite diversified, with the five top import products: telecom equipment, computers, boats, optical equipment, and refined oil accounting for just under 1/4 of total imports from China to the region. I indicated that exports from Latin America to China have been increasing quite significantly. They were equivalent to roughly just under 10% of GDP in 2015. 5 years prior to that, they were only 7%. 5 years prior to that, they were actually 3%. 5 years before that, only 1%. So China's presence in terms of trade relations with Latin America obviously has increased quite a bit in terms of importance. A lot of the exports being sent to China are actually come from extractive industries, right? Minerals, oil, copper, etc. 14% are agro products, and manufacturing actually only accounts for about 3% of total exports. China matters in terms of trade, but it also matters a lot in terms of lending to Latin America and the Caribbean. This is something that people have not been tracking all that much. A lot is said about trade relations, investments from China in Latin America and the Caribbean, but little known fact, China has become an important creditor for some of these countries in Latin America. In fact, last year alone, China lending to Latin America and the Caribbean was twice the amount that the World Bank, the IDB, and CAF combined. So we're talking about $29 billion that came from a couple of policy banks in China, the Chinese Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China. Those two accounted for about $29 billion, whereas the three development lending institutions that I mentioned actually accounted for only $15 billion last year. So twice as much money lending actually came from China to Latin America than from the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and CAF. China lending to Latin America and the Caribbean has increased over time. It actually tripled in 2015. And now the stock of actually lending amounts to about $125 billion. This is only over a space of just over 1 decade, by the way. At the same time, lending from these regional development banks has decreased, as you can see from the graph, the red graph chart. I'm sorry, the red one. The sovereign lending to Latin America from the three institutions that I mentioned before. China, interestingly, has become a very important source of counter-cyclical financing for Latin America and the Caribbean. Lending actually has peaked in those years in which regional GDP has faltered. Right after the global recession in 2010, you can see a significant spike, and last year as well, when there was a bit of a slowdown in regional growth. This is when actually China decided to increase lending to the region and has increased its presence as well and its influence. There's been an interesting shift from discretionary lending from China to Latin America to more like sector-specific lending. This has to do with the fact that some of the discretionary lending, not just to Latin America, but around the world coming out of China actually, was ill-conceived. A lot of the money actually went to fund some frivolous projects, so the Chinese took note of that and very quickly decided to change that and moved away from discretionary lending to more sector-specific lending. This has actually resulted in a high concentration of Chinese lending to Latin America. Energy today accounts for about 56%, infrastructure for about 32%. So quite dramatic in terms of the concentration. A lot of the lending actually, not surprisingly as well, has focused on a small number of countries. Venezuela being the main beneficiary actually of Chinese lending over the past decade, accounting for just north of 50%, 52% to be precise. Brazil 17%, Argentina 12%, Ecuador 12%. And there's a pattern here. And the pattern would suggest that most of the lending is actually going to countries that over the past several years have had limited access to market financing. So the Chinese have actually filled that gap and have increased their amount of lending to those specific countries. Those four, by the way, account for roughly 94% of total lending from China to Latin America. Now, let's not be fooled. I mean, the Chinese obviously are looking to make money here. So much has been said about the fact that the motivation behind the Chinese lending to Latin America has been really a form of increasing political or geopolitical influence, form of diplomacy, if you will. But the Chinese institutions have been driven by this desire to make money as well. As a consequence of that, some of the lending actually coming out of China to Latin America has been more expensive than alternative sources of funding, namely funding from multilateral lending institutions or regional development banks. As I indicated, most of the Chinese lending to Latin America has come from two institutions, the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank. These are so-called policy banks. This is how the Chinese refer to them, and the purpose of them is actually to increase political influence around the world, as I indicated, while at the same time making money. And lastly, just to keep it brief as promised, the third channel in which we're seeing increased influence of China in Latin America is through investments. There are two types of investments, direct investments, that is foreign direct investments. The first one is the so-called greenfield investments, and these are, of course, from the ground up. Alternatively, you have mergers and acquisitions. Most of the actual investments that have taken place actually over the past several years have contributed to making China the second largest source of greenfield FDI in Latin America after the U.S. And China now is the third largest source of FDI through mergers and acquisitions in Latin America after the U.S. and Spain. So quite significant presence, apart from trade and lending, in terms of direct investment in the region. Most of the Chinese greenfield FDI has focused on two sectors, agro and manufacturing. Non-China, by the way, non-China greenfield FDI has focused mostly on manufacturing, communications, and mining, as the graph would suggest. About 3/4 of China M&A actually has gone to oil, natural gas, and mining, right? So extractive sectors as well. And 3/4 of non-China M&A has gone to services. So clearly the priorities have been different between China and the rest of the world. Despite that, obviously the purpose behind this investment is quite similar to an investment that or the financing, the lending that we have seen in Latin America, which is really broadened the sphere of influence that China has in Latin America and the Caribbean. By the way, just since we're in Peru, I'll mention this. China owns roughly 1/3 of Peru's total mining investment portfolio. So there's quite a significant presence of Chinese investment in the Peruvian mining sector as well. Now, this is essentially what we, from a market standpoint, have been tracking as of late. As I indicated before, this is a representation of how important China has become actually for the Latin American regional economy. It's a great contributor to growth, a great driver. I would argue even that in the context of what the news flow that we have seen over the past 10 days or so, Brexit more specifically, I would argue that in terms of the importance for the Latin America region, the Chinese slowdown and whatever happens in China and any reflection of that Chinese slowdown should have a much more severe impact on Latin America in terms of real economic growth potential than anything that happens in Europe, simply because Europe is not as big of a partner, obviously, as China is. There's no, apart from Chile, we just saw this, there's no other country that sends more than 20% of its exports to the European Union in general. I think Peru is roughly 1.5% of exports that go to the UK in particular. So the economic relations between the two sides are quite limited. My understanding is that in terms of FDI, for instance, the UK has made a very negligible contribution to Peruvians' tally as of late, at least over the past few years. So the economic relations with the UK, with the EU more broadly, is quite small if we compare it to the trends that we have seen in terms of China increasing its presence, I insist, in terms of trade, in terms of lending, and in terms of direct investment. And I think I'll leave it at that for the sake of time. Thank you.